Thanks everyone for joining SWE's web session today. The title of our webinar is SWE Public Policy, Federal Budget and Appropriations 101. For those of you on the live webinar, I'd like to point out that the questions function on the GoToWebinar panel can be used for you to submit questions. Go ahead and type your questions in that box and I'll facilitate answering them throughout the webinar as is appropriate. There's also 2 handouts that are available for this webinar, which you can find using the handout function on the GoToWebinar panel. Finally, we'll also provide a recorded version of this GoToWebinar session post-event. Today's webinar is hosted by SWE, and my name is Hannah George, and I'll be joined today by Asha, Balakrishnan, and Della Cronin. For more than 6 decades, SWE has given women and engineers a unique place and voice in the engineering industry. We're centered around a passion for our members' success, and that means empowering women to achieve their full career potentials as engineers and leaders. Della Cronin, our first speaker, is a principal of Bose Public Affairs Group, a comprehensive government affairs and strategic communications consulting firm in Washington, D.C. Cronin brings over 25 years of experience in education and research policy, legislative and regulatory processes, fundraising and public affairs to the firm, having worked for a broad array of education, research, and STEM education companies and interests. In recent years, Cronin has been involved in efforts to elevate the profile of STEM and computer science education in K-12 schools and federal and state policies, as well as equity in education and workforce opportunities. Cronin holds a bachelor's degree in economics and a minor in political science from Virginia Tech. We are also joined by Asha Balakrishnan, a research staff member at the Science and Technology Policy Institute, a federally funded research and development center that provides rigorous and objective analysis on a range of science and technology policy related topics for the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Trained as a mechanical engineer, Asha brings significant analytical experience to STPI in the areas of program evaluation, STEM education and workforce training, manufacturing, and space technologies. She is a board member of the Council of Government Relations of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. Dr. Balakrishnan holds an MS in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, and both of her MS and her PhD are in Mechanical Engineering from MIT. Please join me in welcoming them and enjoying this webinar together.
Hi, everybody. This is Della Cronin. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm looking forward to seeing you in Washington, D.C. later this month. Today, we're going to walk through sort of the Society of Women Engineers advocacy agenda, what we hope you will talk about when you're here later this month with your elected representatives, and some things that are happening in Washington, D.C. that you should know about or at least be aware of before you get here. This first slide sort of gives you an overview of what the advocacy agenda is for SWE. This is taken straight from the website, so it asserts that SWE's public policy initiatives support the Society's mission by engaging our members in policy issues that impact the advancement of women in engineering. The goals are to provide SWE members with timely information and tools to enhance their understanding of the issues and encourage volunteer participation at the federal level. And we also aim to educate other professional societies and policymakers on how to apply Title IX to STEM fields. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about how the organization actually does that. So, given the breadth of the membership of the organization and the very many issues that its members care about, there are a number of places where SWE attempts to be influential in Washington, D.C. On several different policy issues. So there are 4 main areas that we focus on. The first, as is seen on this slide, is strengthening America's schools. I'm sure you all know that we talk quite often about the importance of making sure that young women and people underrepresented in engineering and STEM fields are exposed early and often to STEM fields. and STEM subjects in K-12 schools. As a result, we consistently advocate for ensuring that federal investments support exposure to those students in K-12 schools, and there are a number of different pieces of education legislation and funding bills that we try to influence to that end. We do the same in ensuring that STEM education is supported by federal lawmakers in a way that reflects the national priority placed on growing the STEM workforce. I think one of the points that we make consistently on Capitol Hill is that there's a lot of talk about the importance of STEM education, and we would really like for the policies and the investments to reflect that talk. Secondly, one of the things that we do, and this is something that has been recently in the policy news here in Washington, D.C., is we try to ensure that Title IX is applied to STEM fields and women women in STEM fairly and effectively. Title IX is a pretty sweeping piece of legislation and regulation. It affects a lot of different entities and organizations. And so the efforts that SWE undertakes are really focused on these three elements: making sure that female students are safe at K-12 schools and on college and university campuses, making sure that faculty and administrators and other female employees that work on campuses are in safe and supported workplaces, and making sure that Title IX itself is being applied appropriately at federal agencies so that female researchers are being awarded grants at the rate that they should as they compete with their male researcher colleagues. A third area that we try to influence folks here in town is by strengthening the STEM workforce by ensuring equal opportunity for women in STEM education and careers. This ensures that there are fair workplace policies that support success for female STEM professionals, and asking that there's the appropriate enforcement of existing laws related to discrimination on the basis of sex in employment, pay, and education. You can, this comes into play often, and as folks on Capitol Hill talk about equal pay for equal work and other pieces of legislation. We also are supportive of policies that allow women to be successful on their own terms. This means workplace supports that are important to women at all stages of their careers, making sure that employment policies nurture their needs, and then ensuring that employers are offering the services and programs that women engineers need to be professional in the workplace. So how do we do all these very many different things and try to support all these very different interests and issues? Of course, what you're planning to do later this month is very important to our advocacy goals. It's important to be seen and heard on Capitol Hill in a regular way. Lawmakers like to see that groups are consistent in their engagement and expressing themselves. But I want to be clear that it's not the only thing that the organization does. There are a lot of things it does year round to try and support its members. We're talking to folks on Capitol Hill all the time about these issues. Also, if you don't already know, SWE is a member of a number of coalitions that are making their voices heard on these issues, including the STEM Education Coalition, the National Council on Women and Girls in Education, and then we are a friend to many other allied organizations on more discrete efforts in terms of trying to write or send letters to Capitol Hill or develop legislation that's supportive of a number of issues, including those important to women engineers. We host briefings on topics important to SWE and its members. We do webinars like this one. We also did one on Title IX recently, trying to educate members on the issues that are important to them and what SWE is doing to support them. And then, of course, you know that we host Capitol Hill Day every year, and we're looking forward to seeing you soon to do just that. So in terms of giving you a little bit of a heads up on what you're walking into when you get here later this month, I'm pretty sure that everybody on the phone knows that there was an election last November that resulted in some pretty significant changes on Capitol Hill. We are in the first session of the 116th Congress. Every Congress has 2 sessions, each last a year. We're in the first one of this one. And this gives you some of the numbers that are sort of driving all the climate on Capitol Hill. So in the House, we have 235 Democrats now and 198 Republicans. We have 1 undecided seat. It's a pretty high-profile race in North Carolina that's been plagued with scandal and bad actors. And then 1 vacant seat that's a result of a recent death on Capitol Hill. In the Senate, we have 47 Democrats and 53 Republicans. So while The House flipped in the November election. The Republicans did grow their margins in the Senate, and that has created a bit of a, even if you can imagine, an even more difficult working situation for folks who want to work collaboratively in both the House and Senate. The average age of a member is 58.5 years old, so they're still a little bit of an older bunch. But perhaps the number that's most significant to female groups is that we are now at 24% female, with 102 House members and 25 Senate members. Most of those females are admittedly Democrats. And while we are celebrating 24%, we certainly would like to see that somewhere much closer to 50%, as is the case in the population. There's 21% minority representation within the membership of the House and Senate, making this Congress the most diverse ever. And you can see here some photos of the ladies the day of the State of the Union and a picture of the House freshman class. Hopefully things are going to look a little different this year to those of you who are coming than they did last year. But given what you've been reading in the paper or watching on the news recently, folks are still at odds on so many issues. You can see here that these are representative of some of the things that have happened recently and some of the traditional disagreements. Of course, Republicans and Democrats are each blaming the other for the federal government shutdown. They are fighting over federal spending. They're having decisions about broad budget debates, but wanting to make sure that they are serving their constituents well. And these are all situations that can be difficult in making bipartisan, big, difficult decisions and developing big, complicated pieces of legislation. So what are we going to be talking about this year on Capitol Hill when you're here? So for those of you who have been here before, you've heard me say this when you're here in town. I really want to impress upon you that these folks that you're meeting with are your representatives. They work for you. These meetings are yours. SWE is going to set them up for you, and we're going to give you the tools you need to be successful in these meetings, but these are your opportunity to have your voice heard with the folks who are paid to represent you on Capitol Hill. So as you're coming here on the plane or in your car or walking down the street, I really encourage you to think of a story or two that highlights some of your largest concerns as a female engineer in the workforce, or as a woman preparing to become an engineer, and that you can share with your representative and or his or her staff to make your point about your concerns and how they might be helpful to you in addressing them. These are just some of the issues that we think are important to female engineers in talking to members of Congress. The workforce supply, of course, is really important to STEM industries, in particular those in the defense industry where security clearances and other issues are important. We've been talking increasingly in Washington, D.C. about apprenticeships and internships, but the issue of returnships is something that is becoming more prevalent up here. If you think that that's something that's important to you or your company, I encourage you to talk about that concept with folks on Capitol Hill. Successful STEM education programs in your community, ones that you are seeing success in or that are at your local schools, or perhaps those that you know about that you wish were in your local schools, and if your local schools had better resources, they might be able to use them. To that end, investments in poor schools is important as well. Other challenges for you and your colleagues in your community, the importance of the country's national labs and Department of Defense spending. These are all things that you might want to think about as you're thinking about your story and how you might want to incorporate these issues in those stories. So we also have some specific ideas on things that you might want to talk about in your meetings. These are pieces of legislation that have been introduced already in the 116th Congress that SWE has an opinion about. We like these bills. We think they do good things. There's a bill that would give the ladies of the Hidden Figures movie a Congressional Gold Medal. We think that's a great idea. There's a bill on combating sexual harassment in science, which addresses what we heard from the National Academies last year on a report on sexual harassment in the research workplace, which was quite distressing. This bill goes to addressing those issues. Family Medical Insurance Leave Act, the Paycheck Fairness Act. This Congress is going to be changing the Higher Education Act. And there are changes that we're going to be asking for in that bill to support women and underrepresented populations in the STEM fields, either as students or as faculty. And then the STEM Research and Education Effectiveness Transparency Act, which would require research agencies to collect certain data that we think is important to show where that money is going in terms of female and other demographics on the investigators who are winning awards. We're also going to talk about funding. And on the one of the next slides is going to tell you the specific tools that we're going to give you to inform these asks. So if you're busily taking notes or thinking you need to memorize these things, you don't. We're going to give you materials that's going to outline them before you go up to the Hill that day. Other things that we're going to be asking for is adequate funding for a number of education programs, including one that invests in STEM education, one that invests in teachers and their professional development, one that invests in after school, early childhood education, and then the research on the teaching and learning of STEM subjects. There's been so much research that's shown that kids need to be exposed in multiple ways. Different learners learn differently. Some kids are better served by after school programs that focus on STEM than they are in STEM subjects during the school day. Early childhood education, of course, is very important to math success, which of course is important to all STEM subjects. So these are investments that we think are important, including broad investments in the research agencies that are so important to discovery and innovation. So as I promised, we're going to talk a little bit about what we're actually going to give you while you're here before we send you up to the Hill to meet with your representatives. The day before you go to the Hill, you'll see me again, and I'll tell you what's going on that week on Capitol Hill, how busy or not they are, what's top of mind for members and for their staff. We'll be giving you your schedule for the day, so you know where you need to be when. We'll be giving you talking points that will reiterate the points that I just outlined on those slides about the legislative and funding asks. And I'll be telling you then, as I'm about to tell you now, don't think you need to ask for every single one of those things. You can pick out one or two or three that are really important to you personally and focus on those. We're going to both send a letter to every member of Congress that day and then give you a letter that you can leave with the folks that you meet with that outline the priorities and requests that we're talking about. And then we're going to give you some data. Folks on the Hill love data. And we're going to give you some data on STEM, including state-specific data for you to use in your meetings. And then handy dandy maps that will help you get around Capitol Hill while you're here. So I'm happy to pose for questions. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, so far we do not have any questions submitted yet.
Okay. If anybody has any questions about that content, I'm happy to answer, but I also know that Asha is going to talk. Last year, some feedback that we got from folks who came to town was that those of us who live and swim in the details of Washington, D.C. sort of speak a language and talk about processes that are unfamiliar to folks who come for just a short time. And so we thought it would be helpful to folks who are coming to hear a better explainer of some of these processes, including the budget and appropriations process. So Asha's going to talk about that. And then if there still aren't any questions, we'll both be available for questions after that.
So we do have some questions now. One question is, will we be getting more extensive talking points and details prior to arriving in DC?
So Hannah, I think that's a question for you. I'm not sure what if anything we're sending to folks before we get here.
Yeah, I think so. So we are going to try to send you a general schedule. It'll be preliminary on March 22nd, as well as the more fleshed out talking points on the 22nd of March. And then I think another question is, how do you measure the success of the Capitol Hill event? Della, I'm happy to take a stab at that, unless you want to jump in first.
No, you can go.
Okay, so that's a good question. I think that there's a couple of different measures. We, of course, provide a post-event survey to everyone that's attended the event. And that's, an informal way for us to gauge the immediate impact of our members. I think long-term measuring success in DC is a challenging thing to do. Ultimately, we want to see certain line items that SWE is committed to advocating for receive adequate funding. So there's a good chart that we put out at one of our blog posts a couple of months ago, kind of showing key budget line items that SWE and its members have been advocating for over the last couple of years. What was proposed by the administration, what we advocated for, what ended up being passed. And of course, we're one small voice in the midst of a very loud sea of voices around these issues. But we've been able to see some critical issues that we've really felt strongly about received positive attention. So that's another way of measuring success of the Capitol Hill visits. Ultimately, the measure is the most important measure, which is just connecting attendees with their elected officials. Is harder to measure. That sort of relationship is just important to maintain. So there's no real clear measurement there, but it's something that we believe is really significant, even if there's no concrete way of measuring it.
Yeah, and I will say, I'll add and say that I know that for engineers, this sort of nebulous exercise with results that can take a while to materialize can be unfamiliar, uncomfortable, or difficult to grasp. But I will say, having done some work for SWE for quite a few years now, I've benefited from, in my endeavor to represent SWE on some of these issues, I've benefited from an increasingly high profile of the organization on Capitol Hill as a result of this consistent effort. And then, for folks who come and do this, I hope one measure of success for you will be starting and hopefully maintaining a relationship with your representatives via email. Like, I hope you don't come and then never talk to the folks that you meet with again. I hope that you will think of things that are going on in your company or your community and share information with the folks who represent you in throughout the year and not just in March. And that, I hope, will be a measure of success for you in terms of a relationship with the folks who represent you.
Another question we have is, should we be contacting our elected officials prior to arriving in DC? SWE and Della's team are arranging all those meetings. Another question we have is, what should we wear when visiting? How formal? Need good walking shoes? Della, do you want to?
Yeah, I would not wear your highest heels while you're here. I would wear shoes that you're comfortable walking about a mile in. Those floors on Capitol Hill are unforgiving, and you will be walking back and forth from the House to Senate side, which is about a quarter of a mile. So I always urge err on the side of comfort, but it will be, you should dress in business dress as well. The Congress will be in session while you're here, so staff will be dressed the same way.
Great. And the final question we have is, are engineers more successful at advocating like this? If we're not engineers, how can we ensure we are compelling?
Well, I think anybody who has a story or an interest in any of the issues that are important to engineers or the issues that we're talking about has a role to play that day. I don't think it's an engineer will be more or less successful. I think that a genuine person who's sharing their opinion with folks who work for them will be successful.
Awesome. Thanks for all those answers, and thanks again for your presentation, Della. Now we'll turn it over. The slides have switched over to Asha Balakrishnan slides, who's with the Science and Technology Policy Institute. Asha, welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all today. I work at the Science and Technology Policy Institute, which is a federally funded research and development center that supports the Office of Science and Technology Policy of the President. It's one of the executive offices of the President that works on a lot of cross-agency science and technology issues, including STEM education. So today, my goal really in the next 15 minutes is to help you all understand a few things. One, the timeline of the federal budgeting process and how that process works. The R&D departments and agencies that are relevant to science and engineering, and the differences between authorization and appropriations. These are all kind of key background things that I think might be helpful as you come onto Capitol Hill and talk to people so you understand what procedurally they are dealing with. The last point I want to make is that because there are different committees and often different people making decisions on different committees, I'll talk to you a little bit about specifically that authorization and appropriations piece. They're not exactly the same, and I hope to explain that a little bit better for you. All right. So this slide really is a process slide to some extent. It explains that an individual agency's budget is the reflection of several different stakeholders and the result of a top-down as well as a bottom-up process. So starting with the bottom-up process that encompasses several activities, inputs range from agency leadership, often presidential appointees, so it reflects the president's priorities, to internal agency strategic planning processes. Every agency has different processes to inform them on strategic planning, to external stakeholder input. Sometimes these in the science and engineering fields are through the national academies running decadal surveys or other review panels that inform the agencies on what priorities the stakeholders are encouraging, to other types of internal advisory panels under what we call the FACA committees. So these are advisory groups that are stood up internally to different, in the case of NSF, the different engineering directorates, and have and the programs within them have advisory committees that they stand up and meet pretty regularly to go over their programs. And then lastly, an important piece is the agency's previous budgets. So everything is often based on what was funded in the previous year and what kind of programs are they looking to for the next year. Remember that the agency programs are often multi-year and they fund multi-year awards, and so that they have to make sure that the funds are available to spend on the continuing grants that they funded the previous year, and then determine how much money is going to be available to fund new grants or new programs. So it's a little bit of a mortgaging process when you think about it, of how much money do I have to spend on new things versus paying down what I've committed already. The top-down process is equally multifaceted. The Office of Management and Budget, which is also another executive office of the President office, often termed as OMB, they publish a guidance memo to the agencies, and this is not just R&D agencies. All agencies get an internal guidance memo that's not public. Over the past few years, for example, in this guidance memo, they've asked some agencies to cut their overall budgets by a certain amount, 5% or 10%. So their bottom line in terms of the budget request that comes out is cut. And the agencies have to then figure out internally how they're going to adhere to that policy guidance. Specifically for research and development, OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the Office of Management and Budget jointly publish a public R&D priorities memo. Every year, these priorities change slightly. The memo that was published last year around June 2018 had priorities that included research and development funding to improve national security, promote American leadership in quantum computing and artificial intelligence, as well as educating and training the workforce of the 21st century economy. The memo also included other priority areas as well. So finally, Congress weighs in on priorities and initiatives through legislation and agreements made with the administration. So all of these different activities coming from the top down as well as the bottom up result in an agency's budget. And incidentally, each agency publicly publishes their budget with many, many details, with explanations of existing programs, what types of activities that they had been funding in the previous year, how much they funded it for, and what they're looking for in terms of funding requests for the next year. Remember, this was just a request. This isn't what they're going to get. But the top line numbers for each agency are rolled up, and those are also published in the overall President's budget requests. So that leads me to the next slide to explain a little bit about the time frame. So with the federal budget cycle, it starts in a few different phases. First of all, before I go through this table above, I want to remind everybody, or maybe explain to everybody, that the calendar year and the fiscal year of the federal government are different, and it can be very confusing. So, for example, the fiscal year 2019 started on October 1st, 2018. So when we talk about the budgets in the federal government, we're always talking in terms of fiscal year budget. And so 2020 will start this fall in October 1st, 2019. The FY 2020 budget will be hopefully enacted, but we'll get to that. Typically, the president's budget request is released in February or March of a specific year prior to that fiscal year. So in fact, I was expecting the budget to what we call drop today, but I think it's going to drop next week, March 11th, 2019, for the FY 2020 budget. So that is what OMB, after having to endure a shutdown, has been feverishly working on, preparing, and getting ready for a rollout. So in going back to the table above, I'm going to explain this kind of in two phases. The first phase is this agency planning process. A lot of the things I described on the previous slide on how an agency gets to their budget request, that happens over a 1-year period almost. Agencies propose priorities back and forth with OMB. The priorities memo comes out from OSTP and OMB, and they finally draft their budgets and send them to OMB, usually in August or September of a given year. Phase 2 then starts, and OMB spends the time reviewing it. So as shown in this slide, where I start with year 2, it says phase 2 OMB review. Remember, they're reviewing the following year's budget while it starts October. So they have should be starting a new fiscal year. So it's very confusing because the government is working on, essentially, OMB and the agencies are working on 3 budgets at one time. And that can be a little bit mind-numbing. But essentially, OMB is reviewing agency priorities that will go into the 2021 budget. Let's talk about, this fall. They'll be reviewing those things. And then, like I said, the OMB budget's typically released in February. It's varied over the different years. So given the shutdown and those things, it's not going to be released till March of this year, mid-March. And then we go into a 6-month process. This is phase 3, where Congress gets involved. They hold hearings. They react to the president's budget. The Senate holds their own hearings. The House holds their own hearings. And in theory, they fund an appropriations bill. And I'm going to get to that in a second. But ideally, and what is supposed to happen is before October 1st of that given year, Congress is supposed to pass appropriations budgets for all the agencies so that by whatever that fiscal year is starting, in this case, FY 2020, the agencies will know how much money they have to spend and what Congress has appropriated for them. That is not, in actuality, what ends up occurring. So let me go to the next slide. I'll get back to that when I get to the last piece of this presentation. One piece of this, and I'm jumping around a little bit, but I think it's helpful to just understand the cabinet of the president and where science and technology and R&D fit in. As you can see here, there are, and I didn't do the counting, but all the boxes under the cabinet are cabinet level agencies. These are agencies that have a cabinet member. They sit on the president's cabinet. I've put some box outs of particular offices or sub-agencies that many of you may be familiar with: NIST, USPTO, Census Bureau, FDA. These are all agencies inside or offices inside of large cabinet level agencies. 3 agencies that do not have cabinet representation that are very important to the S&T enterprise and STEM education particularly is the National Science Foundation, NASA, and EPA. So just so you know, the heads of those agencies do not sit on the cabinet. And that doesn't matter totally per se, but it's just a matter of leadership and how that information gets funneled up to the president. One thing I also wanted to note is that 5 of these agencies that I put green boxes around, or I should have, maybe they don't show up in this particular slide. They may have in the PowerPoint. So I apologize about that, but I'll just list them that the Department of Defense, the Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Energy, NASA, and NSF, all of those agencies, their R&D funding represent over 90% of the federal R&D dollars. That's where much of the emphasis for R&D funding is. And just to give you a little bit of numbers context, the FY 2019 presidential request for these R&D agencies, or for not for the agencies, but for R&D funding in total was $131 billion. But in actuality, $151.5 billion was appropriated. So the president's request for R&D has been lower, and the actual was about $20 billion over what the president's budget request stated. You can go to the next slide. Oh, there we go. There's the green bars, and then the red ones represent R&D as well that have that agencies that have R&D funding but are much smaller in terms of total dollar amount. And those are the boxes I was talking about. So these are the the sub-agencies that you might know about and have heard of and where they sit within the president's cabinet. Sorry about that. Thank you. You can keep going. All right. So finally, and this is honestly second to last slide. So one thing that gets very confusing and you don't really quite understand until you're in Washington is the difference between an authorization bill or an authorizing committee and appropriations bills or appropriating committees. So both within the Senate and the House, there are several committees. Many of them are authorizing committees. And authorization means that these committees can discuss and set and create and make laws specific to specific programs. So they can direct NASA or National Science Foundation to develop a STEM strategic plan, as with the Competes Act in terms of what was authorized in the committee to be done. They do not set appropriations dollars, how much money should be spent, but they can set funding ceilings. So they can set, for example, with the James Webb Space Telescope, they can say, NASA, you may spend up to $8 billion doing the R&D and funding James Webb Space Telescope, but they don't have the power to give NASA $8 billion. All they have the power to do is to set and create the program. The Appropriations Committee, in contrast, are the committees that set the amount of money. They are the ones who permit funding. They have the power to incur obligations. Many of the funding bills that come out of the Appropriations Committee are multi-year funding bills. So this can also be confusing. In the case of the National Science Foundation, they have 1 year money. They get money appropriated in a given year, and they have to spend it in that year. The case of the Health and Human Services, particularly the NIH, they get 2 year money. They get money in a given year, and they have 2 years to spend it. The DoD and NASA also have multi-year money. So if you get money, let's say in 2018, you can still spend it in 2019, whereas with the National Science Foundation, that is not the case. And oftentimes, the appropriation committees pass continuing resolutions. Those are often termed as CRs, and these are temporary spending bills. What that means is Congress, the appropriations committees, and the budget groups at large could not come up with an agreed upon amount on how much to spend on discretionary spending. So there's non-discretionary spending, which is Medicare, Medicaid, and entitlements, and discretionary spending is what yearly the Congress votes to appropriate. So I counted over the last 10 years, there have been 34 continuing resolutions. Some of them last a week. So for example, we saw one this past year in 2018. There have been a total of 4 shutdowns over the last 10 years, 3 in the last 2 years, ranging from 9 hours to 35 days. And so in the case of this past shutdown, one thing to note, because you probably heard in the news, and you maybe even know this, that a number of agencies were still running. People would say 75% of the government is already funded. That is because there were several appropriations committees that passed their funding bills. There were others that did not. So that leads me to my last slide. So this gives you a sense of the different subcommittees and the appropriations subcommittees. One thing to note, and I don't have a slide on this, but the Senate and the House have different authorizing committees where the scientific agencies sit in. Those are not always aligned with the committee structure for the appropriations committee, so it can become very, very confusing. But right here, I show you where the appropriations committees are. And remember, this is the committees that actually have the funding. So in the case of this past shutdown, the Defense Department, Labor, Health and Human Services, and Energy and Water were all funded. So that's why 75% of the government was open for those 35 days. The other committees did not have funding. They did not pass their funding. So DHS, as a result, as you know, the air traffic, well, that's not DHS, but the TSA were not working. Interior and the Environment, and Commerce, Science, and Justice, which is NASA and NSF and Department of Commerce, were not funded for those 35 days. So just to give you a sense of where some of that breakdown happens. In past years, other shutdowns, everything was shut down and they weren't able to work. So that is my last slide. I hope I gave you all a little bit of a sense of the landscape for federal R&D. I'm sure there are questions, and if you have any, I'm happy to try and answer them.
Thank you very much, Asha. We'll open it up for questions. One question that did come in about the previous presentation, we'll give anyone a second to type out any questions for this current presentation, was last year I was able to direct other members that couldn't attend the outreach day to the Action Center to send a letter to their reps. Will this be available this year? Yes, we actually already have an action on the Legislative Action Center that highlights some key talking points for anyone who's not able to attend, can send to their elected official. We'll be promoting that to the membership the week of March 24th. And another question that came in regarding the last presentation was, I didn't see any updates on the Action Center throughout the year. Is this something that we should be checking? Generally, we try to do 1 to 2 actions throughout the year. This last year, we only had 1 around DC. Typically, if we do post an action, we promote about it through our blog or different social media outreach efforts. You can also sign up to get text alerts by texting SWE Public Policy to 56512, and any alerts that we send out will text out about as well. So feel free to check it, but we'll also try to make sure that we're communicating if there are alerts that go out. And we do have one question that's come in, and this might be kind of a mixture between Asha and Della. How do we know what relevant votes are pending? And how do we know how our representatives have been voted on SWE, on things SWE promoted in the past?
So I know how to find that information, but I'm trying to figure out how to explain how to find that information. So of course, the House and Senate both keep track of who voted how in every vote that they take. And if you wanted to visit their resources to figure that out, you could. I will say that one of the challenges in figuring out how folks felt about some of the things that we are asking you to talk about that day is that, for example, the investments in Title IV Part A STEM programs, that's going to be part of the Labor, Health, and Human Services education bill that Asha was talking about, which last year was combined with the Department of Defense bill, which turned into the biggest spending bill passed before the shutdown. So it obviously passed both the House and Senate and was signed by the president, and members of Congress weighed the pluses and minuses of what was in that bill and decided to vote for or against it. So it's hard to pull out the exact way that folks felt about specific issues. I will say one thing that you could do before you come is that on the slide that I had in there with all the bill numbers, you could look up those bills and see if your member of Congress has signed on to co-sponsor any of those bills. And if he or she hasn't, while you're there, you could ask them to do that. And you could go to a site called congress.gov and plug in those bill numbers and see who is co-sponsoring them to date. I know that for the engineering crowd, that's not a specific number or yes or no answer, which can be frustrating, but there's so many things about Washington that are frustrating.
Thanks, Della. We have a question for Asha. How does the president's budget inform the final congressional appropriation, if at all?
To my knowledge, it doesn't really. I think it's the start of the process. So it starts with the president's budget request. It is a signal to Congress of what the president wants and what he has worked with his agencies to roll up into a single number. What we've seen in the past few years is that the president's budget request, particularly for R&D, has been quite much lower than the previous year's R&D budget. He's typically zeroed out things like ARPA-E or asked for big cuts in the EPA S&T. This is very consistent with this president's priorities. At the same time, Congress has reinstated all of these things. So there are programs that kind of live year to year, wondering if they're ever going to end up being realized in the president's budget request. So ARPA-E almost consistently for the past few years has been zeroed out, but always gets put back when it comes time through the appropriators. So,
and I'll just add on from the education front, there's a program, the Title II Professional Development Program, that this president has recommended no funding for each time he's had a budget request. But it's also a program that President Obama tried to cut consistently. And to Asha's point, Congress rejected both President Obama's recommendation on that program, and Congress has also ignored President Trump's recommendation on that program. So, yeah, I think that the budget request sends signals, but to Asha's point, they are not always acknowledged by the folks who hold the power of the purse.
Great, thank you both. We have another question. Is it more efficient to ask our representatives for broad scope projects and initiatives, or to ask for a few specific action items? What is the best approach to be the most effective?
So I would recommend that you look at the slides from today, which outline a number of asks, and the materials that we give you when you're here, and pick out one or two or three issues that speak to your interests most directly, and so that you can make the best heartfelt argument for those concerns. I would say that when you're here, and this will be part of what we talked to you about the day before you go to the Hill, assuming that the president's budget request does come out next week, budgetary issues will probably be top of mind for folks on the Hill. And so as a result, it might be those requests that will carry the most significance, just because that will be top of mind for everybody. But we'll try and guide you the day before on what we think are going to be the requests that land most significantly the day you're up there.
Great. And another question for Asha. Have there been any notable trends in federal R&D or research and development appropriations over the past 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, there have. And so, and if I just talk about 10 years ago was this big boost, if you can recall the downturn of 2008. And there was a big burst we called it the ARA funding. So this was about, I think R&D got an additional $10 billion, maybe more, sorry, $30 billion of funding during that year. So there was a big spike in R&D appropriations in that year. And then it's really in real dollars. Again, we talk about things in constant dollars. Since 2009, since that spike, R&D funding's been fairly flat. And it's gone up a little bit in recent years, particularly in the fact that in the last 2 years, R&D has actually been doing pretty well, despite the fact that the president's budget has asked for cuts. And so it is really, in large part, been flat, and it's also kind of where the money has gone. The president's budget request often asks for more federal R&D funding for DoD and national security priorities, and less for some of the other priorities that he's not as interested in. But in actuality, that hasn't been necessarily what's been appropriated.
Thanks. And we have time for one more question, and we have one more question. And that final question is, what specifically, generally, will be the highest priority for Congress around the end of March?
I think it'll be spending. I think, this week we're seeing a fight between Senate Republicans and the White House about the declaration of a national disaster to fund the border wall. Next week, the budget comes out. Following week, apparently more detailed budget documents will come out, and then folks in the House and Senate will be eager to start their work of developing appropriations bills per the process that Asha outlined. So generally speaking, I think it will be spending.
All right, well, on behalf of SWE, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to add to that. One thing that might be useful to just also understand, I think it's helpful. I think the question's a great one. When you guys come, what would be the most important pressing things on the minds of the Congress members? And I do think that the president's budget request will be one of them. But linking that back to some of the priorities and some of the authorization bills, because many of the authorization bills, in order to realize the potential of what they're looking for, like the sexual harassment bill or the STEM bill, it requires funding. And so there has to be, at some point, kind of an intersection between, okay, we can only do so much with the funding we have, and every time there's a legislative priority that's put in an authorization bill, if it doesn't come with more money, you're just doing trade-offs at the agency. And so I do think spending some time thinking about what are some of those acts that have been passed or have been introduced, and what kind of funding is going to be required for them, and seeing if any funding requests or cuts have been the result, or have been put in the president's budget request for those things, would be somewhat of a valuable exercise.
Oh, and we have one more quick question. So just another question just around sending out some additional information. And we will be sending out additional information about the legislative and funding priorities prior to the event in DC. That was just a request for additional information before the meeting in DC. And yes, we will be sending out additional information. On behalf of SWE, thank you to Asha Balakrishnan and Della Cronin again so much for your thoughtful presentations and for your subject matter expertise. We all are grateful for your input and guidance on these issues. And thank you to all of our participants for attending today's session. If you learned and enjoyed this web session, and we hope you did, you can find out more about SWE's public policy work on our All Together blog under the Advocacy tab. Thank you again for attending, and this concludes our broadcast.